This video covers the pivotal Supreme Court case, District of Columbia v. Heller, decided in 2008 using mock trial materials to explore the arguments and evidence. This case was the first major federal trial to test the modern meaning of the Second Amendment. Dick Heller sued after D.C. denied his application to register a handgun for self-defense, challenging the D.C. law that effectively banned new handguns and required secured storage of all firearms. The factual background reveals that D.C.'s Firearms Control Regulations Act prohibited most handgun registration and required rifles and shotguns to be unloaded and secured. Heller, a D.C. special police officer, was denied registration, creating a conflict between public safety and individual constitutional rights. The 1986 D.C. regulation included a comprehensive handgun ban. Dick Heller, a retired officer, filed suit after his registered revolver was seized, claiming the law violated his Second Amendment rights. The legal context showed that before Heller, courts often applied a collective right theory based on United States v. Miller. The district court initially dismissed the case, supporting the militia-related rights interpretation. However, the D.C. Circuit reversed, holding that the Second Amendment protects an individual right. This led the District of Columbia to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. The plaintiff, Heller, argued for an individual right theory, emphasizing self-defense at home. Arguments relied on historical precedent and textual analysis, asserting that a blanket prohibition on handguns disarms law-abiding citizens. The defendant, the District of Columbia, argued for the collective right theory, tying the Second Amendment to militia service. They relied on police power for public safety and sought deference to legislative judgment on firearms regulation, citing United States v. Miller. This scene provides a visual break before diving into the core arguments and submitted evidence of the trial. Here we focus on the arguments and the witnesses involved in the case of District of Columbia v. Heller. The District of Columbia's case theory centered on the Second Amendment being a collective right. They argued the handgun ban was a reasonable measure, driven by a compelling interest in reducing gun violence, and that storage requirements prevented accidents. The district court phase of Heller was resolved entirely on motions, affidavits, declarations, and documentary evidence, as the case hinged on pure questions of law. There were no live witnesses or cross-examination in the district court. The District of Columbia submitted declarations from 5 experts supporting the handgun ban and storage requirements. These included Dr. Colin Lofton on violence statistics and Chief Charles Ramsey discussing D.C.'s gun violence history. The district filed expert declarations from 5 individuals, including criminologists and public health researchers, to provide data on handgun violence, firearm risks, and law enforcement concerns supporting the government's regulations. This scene highlights the arguments and witnesses presented in the Heller case. Again, it's important to note that the district court phase of District of Columbia v. Heller relied on sworn declarations and documentary evidence, as it addressed legal questions rather than factual disputes that would require live testimony. Heller's theory of the case argued the Second Amendment protects an individual right for self-defense. They contended D.C.'s total ban on handguns and restrictive storage requirements were unconstitutional, undermining the fundamental right to self-defense. Dick Heller, the plaintiff, was a 30-year D.C. police officer. His testimony highlighted a legitimate self-defense need and the personal harm caused by the seizure of his gun, making him the human face of the constitutional debate. As a licensed retired police officer, Dick Heller's role was critical. His testimony, though in declaration form, focused on his compliance with rules, his need for self-defense, and the emotional distress caused by the confiscation of his firearm. Dr. Michael J. Stevens, a constitutional historian, provided expert testimony for the plaintiff. He traced the, quote, right of the people from colonial times, arguing the militia clause was a conditional limitation, not a definition of the right to bear arms. Dr. Stevens, a professor of legal history, was essential in providing historical context. He testified that the individual right predates the militia clause, although he acknowledged early America also emphasized collective defense. Dick Anthony Heller, the lead plaintiff, submitted a sworn declaration describing his specific circumstances as a special police officer and his pursuit of registering a handgun for home defense, which was denied under the D.C. law. Shelley Parker, another plaintiff, was a community activist in a high-crime area. Her declaration detailed threats from drug dealers and underscored her need for a handgun for personal protection. Tom G. Palmer, a Cato Institute scholar, submitted a declaration describing a past self-defense incident and his desire to keep a handgun to ensure his ability to protect himself in the future. Jillian St. Lawrence, a competitive shooter, was another plaintiff. Her sworn statement indicated her interest in owning a handgun for home protection, highlighting the impact of the ban on responsible gun owners. Tracy Ambo, a federal employee, also submitted a declaration, emphasizing her specific desire to own a handgun for the purpose of defending herself and her home. George Leone, an attorney, was among the 6 original plaintiffs. His declaration focused on his legal right and need to register a handgun for the defense of his home. The declarations from the 6 plaintiffs provided the personal context for the case. They explained their circumstances and need for a functional firearm, serving as the only, quote, witness evidence for Heller's side. The core constitutional questions revolved around whether the Second Amendment protects an individual right, whether that right is strictly tied to militia service, and if D.C.'s total handgun ban was a permissible regulation. The district court initially dismissed Heller's case, adopting the collective right interpretation, meaning the Second Amendment protected only militia rights. This ruling upheld the D.C. handgun ban. Following the district court dismissal, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the decision, upholding the individual right to bear arms. The District of Columbia then appealed, taking the case to the Supreme Court. In the majority opinion, the Supreme Court affirmed the D.C. Circuit's decision, declaring the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess firearms, unconnected to militia service. Consequently, the D.C. handgun ban was struck down as unconstitutional. The dissenting opinion maintained the collective right interpretation, arguing that the Second Amendment is strictly tied to militia service. They viewed the D.C. handgun ban as a permissible public safety measure and criticized the Supreme Court for overstepping. Justice Scalia, writing for the majority, emphasized that the right to self-defense is central to the Second Amendment, affirming an individual right unconnected to militia service. He concluded that a total ban on handguns is unconstitutional. The Supreme Court's ruling in Heller affirmed the individual right to bear arms, unconnected to militia service, and struck down the D.C. handgun ban, marking a historic shift in Second Amendment interpretation. This concludes our video on the District of Columbia v. Heller case and the constitutional questions it addressed.